I've always believed in being a good neighbour, not the kind that throws block parties or borrows sugar every weekend, but the quiet, respectful type who waves in the morning and keeps the lawn tidy. When my wife and I bought our home in this HOA-managed suburb, we were drawn in by the promise of peace and order. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, organised, and the kind of place where kids played on the sidewalks and people looked out for one another. At least, that's what we thought. Our house sat on a cosy corner lot with just enough space for a small garden and a couple of trees that rustled gently in the breeze. I kept up with the HOA guidelines, read the handbook, made sure nothing was out of line. I even attended a meeting or two when time allowed, just to stay informed. We liked it here. It felt safe. That was before we got to know Karen. She lived across the street in a large two-story home with beige siding, trimmed hedges, and a white fence that looked charming from afar. Up close, though, there was an entirely different energy. Karen was the kind of neighbour who peeked through her blinds when you pulled into your driveway 2 minutes past the HOA's quiet hours. She smiled with her mouth, but never with her eyes. And she had opinions about everything: where your trash bins should be, how often you watered your lawn, and whether your welcome mat was within policy. At first I chalked it up to nosiness, maybe a lonely woman trying to feel involved, but as time passed her passive-aggressive comments started to bite deeper, and I had no idea just how far she'd go to make sure everyone else played by her rules, even if she didn't. It started small, almost laughably so. One afternoon, as I was trimming the hedge near our driveway, Karen strolled over under the pretense of saying hello. She pointed at the edge of my grass with a frown and said, "You know, your lawn is about half an inch taller than HOA guidelines allow. Just thought you should know, they've been checking lately." Her tone was sweet, but it carried that condescending edge, the kind that made you question whether she was trying to help or quietly threatening you. I nodded, thanked her, and went back to trimming, brushing it off as a minor annoyance. But the comments didn't stop there. The next week, she remarked that our recycling bins were visible from the street, something I hadn't realised was a problem, especially since they were placed just beside the garage, neatly arranged and never overflowing. Still, I moved them further back behind the shrubs just to avoid friction. 2 days later, she dropped a printout of the HOA trash policy in my mailbox with a note that read, "Just in case you're unfamiliar." The ink wasn't even dry. Soon after, I received my first official letter from the HOA. It cited unapproved yard decor and warned me to remove the string of solar lights I'd installed along the walkway. They were tiny, barely noticeable at night, and bought specifically because the packaging said HOA compliant. But someone had reported them, and I didn't need to guess who. I removed them without protest, but my frustration simmered quietly. It was like being slowly pecked at. Nothing big enough to fight over, but constant enough to wear you down. Over the next month, the pattern continued. A complaint about my car being parked a few inches over the sidewalk one evening. Another about a wind chime supposedly making too much noise, even though it barely tinkled in the breeze. I started feeling like I was under surveillance. Every move I made around the house felt like it might end up in another report. I tried to stay civil, to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she just cared too much. Maybe she thought she was helping maintain standards, but deep down, I knew better. Karen wasn't interested in rules, she was interested in control, and I was just her latest target. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when I decided to install a small wooden swing under the old oak tree in our front yard. It wasn't elaborate, just a basic bench swing I'd stained and sealed myself, hung from sturdy ropes, with soft cushions my wife picked out in calming earth tones. It was meant to be a peaceful corner, a little haven to read a book or sip coffee in the mornings. I'd even double-checked the HOA handbook before putting it up. Nowhere did it say anything about swings being prohibited, especially ones that didn't touch property lines or obstruct sidewalks. Within an hour of installing it, Karen appeared across the street, standing on her front porch with her arms crossed. She stared for a solid minute before going back inside. I knew that look. She wasn't just observing. She was calculating. That evening, I heard the familiar sound of her storm door creak open and shut. Then her voice, low and purposeful, carried just enough across the lawn as she spoke on the phone. I didn't hear the words, but I caught the tone, the rhythm, the clipped formality she reserved for official business. 3 days later, I came home from work to find a white truck with a city emblem parked in front of my house. A man in a collared shirt stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Good afternoon," he said. "We've received a complaint from a resident about a potential code violation on your property. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" I nodded, a mix of confusion and dread settling in. He walked with me to the front yard and gestured toward the swing. "This is what the complaint is regarding. I'll need to assess whether it violates any city ordinances or HOA codes." As we spoke, Karen peeked from her window, phone in hand. She thought she'd caught me in the act, thought this was her moment of triumph. But after a careful inspection, the officer made a few notes and turned to me with a shrug. "Honestly, it looks fine. I'll file a report, but I don't see anything that violates code." Relief washed over me. But it was fleeting. Because in that moment, as he glanced toward Karen's side yard, something flickered across his face. A curiosity, a question, something she hadn't planned for. The officer was professional, polite even, but you could tell he was used to dealing with this kind of thing. He had that look, half amused, half exhausted, as if he already knew how these calls usually played out. After checking the swing and taking a few photos, he asked if he could take a quick look around the front and sides of the property. I agreed. We walked slowly, him pointing out minor things like a barely cracked stepping stone near the driveway and a slightly leaning mailbox post. Nothing that screamed violation, more like friendly suggestions. As we rounded the corner toward the side yard, he paused and squinted across the street. "That white fence," he said casually, "is that part of your property?" I shook my head. "No, that's Karen's place." He nodded slowly, jotting something on his clipboard, not saying anything more. I stayed silent too. I didn't want to seem like I was nudging him toward anything. Let him see it on his own. When we got back to the front, he thanked me for my cooperation. "Honestly, this swing isn't a problem. It's well maintained, not obstructing anything. I'll file my report as such. But keep an eye on that mailbox. It could become a tripping hazard if it leans further." He smiled a little and handed me a copy of his inspection sheet. No fines, no citations. Just a record for the file. I glanced toward Karen's house. Her blinds shifted ever so slightly. She was watching. As he returned to his truck, I saw him look once more toward her fence. From the street, it didn't look too bad. But if you got closer, you'd see it was a mess. Paint peeling, warped boards, uneven height. I'd noticed it before but never thought to say anything. It wasn't my business. I wasn't like Karen. But that look on the officer's face, that slight furrow in his brow, told me maybe it had just become someone's business. He pulled away slowly, and I stood there on the porch with a strange feeling brewing inside me. I hadn't done anything wrong, and yet I had been forced to defend myself. Meanwhile, the person trying to call me out was standing behind a fence full of problems, assuming no one would ever look her way. That evening, after dinner, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the thick HOA handbook in front of me. It was one of those things I had skimmed when we first moved in, but never really studied. Now, I read it like my life depended on it. Page by page, section by section, I looked for anything that might explain how someone like Karen could weaponize vague language to harass her neighbors. The more I read, the more I understood how people like her thrived, using ambiguous phrasing, subjective terms like aesthetic uniformity or community harmony, twisting them to justify personal vendettas. But then I saw something that made me pause. Section 12, page 36. All perimeter fencing must be constructed of approved materials, regularly maintained, uniformly painted, and not exceed 6 feet in height at any point. Any visible deterioration may result in a citation. I read it twice. Karen's white fence, chipped paint, slanted posts and all, was clearly in violation of nearly every line. I grabbed my phone and walked outside, careful not to be seen. From the sidewalk, I zoomed in with my camera. Several panels leaned outward, like they were giving up. The paint had yellowed in places, with spots flaking off entirely. The height wasn't even consistent. One section looked closer to 7 feet, towering unevenly where the ground sloped. I took a dozen photos from different angles, making sure to stay within public right-of-way. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just doing what Karen had done to me, but this time with actual cause. Back inside, I uploaded the images to a folder and printed out the fencing regulation from the handbook. I stared at the printout, Not because I needed to, but because I was marveling at the irony. Karen had spent so much time watching everyone else, so obsessed with policing others, that she'd forgotten to look at her own property, or maybe she assumed no one else would dare challenge her. But I wasn't playing her game. I wasn't out for revenge. I just wanted fairness. And maybe, just maybe, it was time someone reminded Karen that the rules applied to her too. The next morning, I submitted a formal complaint to the city's Code Enforcement Office. I attached the photos, included the exact section from the HOA handbook, and detailed what I had observed about the fence's condition. My tone was respectful, straightforward. I didn't mention Karen by name, just the property address and the issues clearly outlined. No embellishments, just facts. I copied the HOA board as well, adding a short note saying I had become aware of the violations while reviewing regulations after my own recent inspection. There was something oddly cathartic about it, not because I wanted to get back at her, but because I was finally standing up for myself. After weeks of being picked at and nitpicked, of trying to stay quiet while someone else created chaos, I was doing exactly what she had done. Only this time, there was a real problem to report. I wasn't bending rules to get someone in trouble. I was pointing out a rule that had long been broken and conveniently ignored. 2 days later, I got a reply from Code Enforcement confirming they had opened an investigation. That same afternoon, an HOA representative emailed me thanking me for bringing the issue to their attention. The tone was different from the cold, clipped warnings I'd received before. This one was almost grateful. Maybe Karen's reign of selective enforcement was starting to crack. I didn't say a word to her. I still waved if we crossed paths, still kept my lawn neat, still parked within the lines, but I could feel the energy shift. Karen hadn't mentioned the swing again. She didn't come outside with her usual clipboard and concerned expression. The blinds were still there, but now they twitched more frequently, the watcher suddenly aware that she might be watched too. There was no satisfaction in catching someone out of bounds for no reason. But when the person who made it their mission to control everyone else finally got a taste of accountability, it felt right. The tables hadn't just turned, they'd leveled. And I was no longer playing defense. I had learned the rules, learned them better than Karen ever expected I would, and now I was holding her to the same standard she demanded from everyone else. The morning of the inspection came sooner than I expected. I was sipping my coffee on the porch when the same white city truck rolled up and parked just beyond Karen's driveway. The officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, calm and methodical like before. But this time, he didn't walk toward my house. He headed straight to Karen's front gate. She must have seen him through the window because seconds later, her door swung open. At first, she tried the polite approach, big smile, exaggerated friendliness, stepping out onto the lawn like she'd just happened to be there. I couldn't hear their words clearly, but I saw her hand gestures, the way she pointed across the street, no doubt trying to deflect attention, probably bringing me up like I was somehow behind all this. The officer didn't seem fazed. He nodded politely, then turned to the fence and began his inspection. Tape measure out, camera clicking, notes scribbled. Karen followed him like a shadow, talking non-stop, occasionally glancing toward me with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. I gave her nothing, just a calm, unreadable expression and another sip from my mug. Her pacing grew more frantic as the officer examined the warped boards, measured the uneven height, and paused at a section where the paint had completely peeled away. She leaned in, saying something with forceful energy, but he held up his hand and kept writing. Then came the moment I knew would come. He handed her a yellow slip, an official citation. Karen's face tightened. Her voice rose, sharp and high-pitched, loud enough for me to hear a few scattered words like ridiculous and targeted. She pointed at my house again, clearly making it personal now. But the officer just thanked her for her time and walked back to his truck without further debate. As he pulled away, she turned her gaze to me. For the first time, she didn't look smug or confident. She looked rattled, exposed. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The swing still hung peacefully from the tree, gently swaying in the morning breeze, and across the street, Karen stood frozen on her now Cited lawn, her white fence no longer just an eyesore, but an official violation. Word travels fast in a neighborhood like ours. By the end of the week, whispers floated through the air like leaves in the wind. It started with casual glances. A few neighbours slowing their walks near Karen's property, eyes drawn to the bright yellow citation still clipped to the fence like a badge of shame. Some people stopped pretending to be surprised. Others shook their heads and chuckled under their breath, as if everything they'd tolerated from her for years had finally caught up with her. At the mailbox, a neighbour I barely knew leaned over and whispered, "About time someone said something." Another gave me a subtle thumbs up as he jogged past. No one outright celebrated, but the mood had shifted. It was as if the entire street exhaled a breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. Karen, once the self-appointed sheriff of the block, had lost her badge, and everyone knew it. She didn't come out as much after that. The blinds still moved, but she didn't step onto her porch, didn't patrol the sidewalks with her clipboard anymore. Her tone at HOA meetings, I later heard, had softened. Apparently, she skipped the next one entirely. A few people told me that the board had quietly revised how complaints were reviewed. No more anonymous submissions without proper evidence. I wasn't named, but I could feel the ripple effect of what had happened. There was no parade, no dramatic confrontation, just a slow erosion of the power Karen once held over the block. People started planting new flowers, putting up small wind chimes again, even repainting their mailboxes in colours that didn't match the standard beige. It was like the neighbourhood had been waiting for a sign that it was okay to breathe, to be human, to stop fearing the next passive-aggressive warning. As for me, I went back to living the way I had before the nonsense began. I read on the swing in the mornings, waved to passing neighbours, and kept my yard tidy. Not because someone told me to, but because I took pride in it. Karen still lived across the street, still behind that white fence, but now she watched more than she spoke, and from what I could tell, that suited everyone just fine. In the weeks that followed, the neighbourhood settled into a new kind of quiet. Not the tense, watched-over stillness that had defined it before, but something calmer, easier. Karen, once the ever-present I, had all but disappeared from public view. She still lived there, of course. Her fence was eventually repaired, repainted, and trimmed to regulation height, but it didn't happen overnight. There was something poetic in how long it took, a slow, reluctant acknowledgement that even she wasn't above the rules she once brandished like a weapon. We never spoke about what happened. There were no apologies, no confrontations, no doorbell confessions. But something had shifted between us. When our eyes met across the street, she looked away, first now. She stopped glaring, stopped nitpicking, stopped trying to intimidate. I didn't need her friendship, and I certainly didn't want her approval. What I had wanted all along was fairness, respect, the simple freedom to enjoy my home without the constant fear of a complaint hanging over my head. I started spending more time on the porch swing, especially in the evenings. The sunsets seemed richer, the air lighter. Neighbours would wave more often, linger a bit longer in conversation. Without realizing it, the tension that Karen had brought into the community began to dissolve. People reclaimed their space, their small joys, their right to breathe freely. Justice hadn't come in a loud, dramatic way. It arrived quietly, like a gust of wind through the leaves, brushing away the weight of unjust scrutiny. And as I sat beneath the old oak tree, the swing creaking gently beneath me, I couldn't help but smile at the way things had unfolded, not out of spite, but out of peace. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't just protect your space, it restores the balance for everyone around you.